The wind howled through the empty streets, like a ghost searching for company. The city was alive with a buzz of lights, but here in the stillness of the highway, there was only silence. Only the hum of the broken-down engine and the occasional flicker of the dashboard lights, signaling the end of yet another failed attempt to start the car. Rachel sat alone in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, her heart heavy with anxiety. The evening was supposed to have been peaceful, maybe even romantic. Instead, she found herself stranded on a dark, desolate stretch of road, 8 months pregnant, alone in a car that was more of a trap than a vehicle. In the passenger seat, a bag of groceries lay untouched, a stark reminder of the mundane life she had come to accept, the life she'd sacrificed for the man she loved. She looked down at her swollen belly and placed her hand over it. "It's just a flat tire, Rachel. Just a flat tire," she whispered to herself, though the fear in her voice betrayed her calm exterior. She wasn't just worried about the car. She was terrified of what might be coming next. Jason, her husband, had promised her a quiet evening, a little dinner, a little time to unwind after the stress of the week. They hadn't seen each other much lately, and she had hoped tonight might be their chance to reconnect. But as the minutes ticked by and his phone went straight to voicemail for the third time, the harsh reality of their relationship started to settle over her like a cold fog. She had loved him once. Deeply, he was charming, brilliant, and had that magnetic confidence that made every room he walked into light up. But somewhere between the expensive dinners, the designer suits, and the endless business meetings, she had lost him. Or maybe he had lost her. Or maybe they had both simply stopped trying. Rachel had met Jason years ago, back when he was a young, hungry entrepreneur with fire in his eyes and dreams big enough to rival the skyscrapers he now owned. She had been a rising star in her own field, full of ambition and passion. Their connection had been immediate, a whirlwind romance that quickly escalated to marriage. She had admired his drive, the way he could make anyone believe in his vision. She believed in him, too, wholeheartedly, and that belief had carried her through the early years of their marriage. The long hours he worked, the late nights away, the constant pressure of his business demands. She had stood by his side, offering unwavering support. She'd been there when he signed his first big deal, when his company became the talk of the town, when he bought his first luxury car. She had been there, always, but as the years passed, things began to shift. Jason's success had started to create a distance between them, a chasm that widened with every new venture he undertook. His ambition grew, but so did his disregard for her needs. The late nights out with friends, the business trips that turned into weekends in exotic places, the promises he'd made about spending more time together, all of them empty. When Rachel found out she was pregnant, she had hoped this would change everything. This was their family, her family, but instead, Jason had grown more distant. He threw himself into work, claiming the pressure was too much, the stakes too high. His work was important. He reminded her, more important than anything else. Rachel had tried to be understanding, but the loneliness crept in, insidious and cold. It was as though the more she gave, the less she received in return. She was still the same woman who had once inspired his heart to race, but now she felt like a shadow of that person. His phone calls were shorter, his texts less frequent. The nights she spent alone, curled up in their large, empty bed, had become routine. Now, here she sat, alone on the side of the road, pregnant and vulnerable, wondering where her husband was, wondering if he even cared enough to be there when she needed him. Her phone buzzed. She looked down at the screen, hope rising in her chest, only to feel it crash just as quickly when she saw the name. Jason. She swiped the screen to answer, but before she could even speak, she heard his voice, carefree and distant. "Hey, babe, I'm so sorry. Something came up. I'm going to be late. I'll make it up to you, promise." The words felt hollow, like a script he had rehearsed. She swallowed hard, fighting back the tears. "I'm stranded, Jason. The car's broken down, and I don't know what to do. It's dark and I'm scared." There was a pause on the other end of the line. She could almost hear him glancing at his watch, his voice slipping back into business mode. "Look, I'll be there as soon as I can. Just hang tight. I'm at a party right now. Things are a little crazy. You know how it is." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, pressing the phone to her ear. The words felt like a slap. A party. That was what he was choosing over her and their child. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She had always understood his ambition, his drive, but this felt like something more. This felt like neglect. Jason was living in a world she didn't belong to anymore. A world where she was an afterthought, a footnote in the story of his success. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she could keep pretending everything was okay. "Jason, I need you." Her voice cracked, but there was no response. Just a faint sound of music in the background, the hum of laughter and the clinking of glasses. Back in his penthouse suite, Jason stood by the window, gazing out over the skyline, a drink in hand. He hadn't even thought to check his phone in over an hour. His friends, his business partners, surrounded him, all of them caught up in the whirlwind of celebration, each one more enamored with the lifestyle he had built than with the man behind it. The penthouse was luxurious. Sleek furniture, modern art on the walls, a view that would make anyone jealous. Jason felt invincible here, untouchable. He had worked hard for all of this, hadn't he? He had built this empire, had made all the right moves. What he did now was simply the reward for his hard work. But when he thought of Rachel, something gnawed at him. He should have been there for her. He should have shown up. Maybe he would later. But for now, this party, these people, his success, this was what mattered. The tension between them had been building for months, simmering just beneath the surface. Rachel was beginning to realize what Jason had been too blind to see. It wasn't the car that had broken down. It was their marriage. From the moment Jason entered her life, Rachel had known he was different. There was an undeniable pull about him, a force that seemed to make everything around him feel secondary. His confidence was magnetic, his ambition unwavering. He wasn't just a man with a vision. He was the kind of man who could make others believe in it, too. And Rachel, always drawn to that drive, believed in him wholeheartedly. She believed in them. In the beginning, it was a whirlwind romance. Jason, the self-made entrepreneur with fire in his eyes, had captivated her with his ideas, his passion, and his promise of a life filled with adventure. He sold her not just on his business, but on their future. They were a team, he'd said, a power couple destined for greatness. And for a while, Rachel had been happy to play her part in that dream. She supported him every step of the way, attending high-end dinners, standing beside him at charity galas, and holding his hand as they rubbed elbows with the city's elite. Jason's empire grew, and with it, their lifestyle became one of luxury and excess. They lived in a stunning penthouse with glass walls that offered panoramic views of the city below, a home that looked like something from a movie set. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and the walls inside their home were adorned with art so rare it could have been sold for millions. It was the kind of life people only dreamed of. And Rachel had dreamed of it too, at first. But the glitter of it all soon began to dull. Over the years, Rachel had become an expert at wearing the mask of perfection. She was a perfect wife, always there to support Jason, always smiling, always attending the functions, the meetings, the events. But behind closed doors, something had started to shift. Jason, the man she had married for his ambition, had become a stranger in their own home. His world was consumed by business deals, meetings that ran late into the night, and a schedule so packed there was little room left for her. At first, she had been patient. She told herself it was just temporary, just a busy season. Once the business was more secure, they would have time to enjoy each other again. They would slow down. But as the months passed, Rachel started to feel the weight of his absence more acutely. The penthouse, once a symbol of their shared success, felt empty, hollow. The expensive furniture, the gleaming marble floors, the designer curtains, they all felt like cold decorations in a house that was no longer a home. And what hurt the most was that Rachel had come to realize she didn't just miss Jason's presence. She missed him. She missed a man who had promised her a life of adventure, but who had left her to navigate the complexities of their relationship alone. Now, pregnant with their first child, Rachel's world felt smaller. Her once vibrant support for Jason had started to fray at the edges. She was no longer just a wife in the background of his success. She was a woman carrying their future, a future that she felt increasingly uncertain about. Her body was changing, Her emotions were in flux, and the dreams she once had for them were beginning to feel like distant echoes. Jason, on the other hand, had fully embraced his life of luxury. The penthouse was his domain, and he was often out, either entertaining business partners, indulging in his own parties, or escaping to another city for work. His focus was always on the next deal, the next big win. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten about the woman beside him, forgotten about the one who had helped him build this empire, the one who had supported him when it was just the two of them against the world. Rachel didn't complain. She never did. She had been raised to be strong, to be the supportive wife, to smile and nod when things weren't perfect. And she had done that for years. But now, with their baby on the way, she couldn't ignore the cracks in their foundation anymore. She had become a silent observer in a life that once felt like hers, but now belonged to a stranger. She could hear Jason's footsteps when he finally came home late at night, a faint sound echoing through the long, empty hallways of the penthouse. She could smell the faint traces of perfume on his clothes or hear the distant echoes of his business, calls ringing through the walls. He'd still kiss her forehead before heading to bed, but it felt hollow, like a routine. She had started to feel less like his partner and more like an accessory in his world. There when needed, forgotten when not. And now, with the baby growing inside her, Rachel's vulnerabilities felt sharper, more pronounced. Every morning she woke up, already tired, already worried. Her once carefree spirit now carried the weight of their relationship on her shoulders. She had always believed in their dreams, in the future they would build together. But with each passing day, those beliefs started to fade. The loneliness had become her constant companion. Even though Jason was physically present, he had become a ghost in their life. And she, despite the luxury surrounding her, had never felt so isolated. This was the life Rachel had now. One of luxury, yes, but also one profound loneliness. She had everything money could buy, but she was slowly losing the one thing she truly wanted. The man she had once fallen in love with. And with their baby on the way, Rachel couldn't shake the fear that the life she had imagined, the family, the future, was slipping away from her faster than she could catch up. Now, sitting in the car, stranded in the dark, her mind raced with thoughts of everything she had endured. Her hand rested gently on her swollen belly, her fingers trembling as the cold began to seep in. She wanted to believe that Jason would come back for her. She wanted to believe that their future, their family, still mattered to him. But deep down she knew this wasn't the man she had married anymore, and she wasn't sure if he was ever coming back. Rachel's world had become a series of quiet, lonely moments that stretched endlessly into the night. Each day, she watched as Jason drifted further away, consumed by his work and his pursuits. He would come home late, his mind still preoccupied with the deals he had to close or the parties he had attended, always with an air of distance between them. It was as if she were watching him live a life that didn't include her anymore. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt cold, hollow. The sound of the front door opening at night, followed by the clink of his shoes against the marble floors, no longer brought comfort. It had become a reminder that he was there, but not truly there. Rachel would be in the living room, curled up with a book or lost in her thoughts, and Jason would walk past her, his face buried in his phone, never pausing for a moment to engage. She had tried, countless times, to initiate a conversation, to share her thoughts and the small joys of her day, but each attempt seemed to fall flat. He was always too busy, too tired, or just not interested. The distance between them wasn't just emotional, it was physical. She had started to feel like an afterthought in her own home. Jason was always working or out with clients. And Rachel, despite her growing belly, would be left to navigate their life on her own. The baby they had once celebrated, their shared dream of becoming parents, was now a reminder of the life she was carrying alone. Jason's lack of involvement in the pregnancy only deepened her isolation. She had once imagined him doting on her, helping her through the tough moments, cherishing the new life they were about to bring into the world. But now, it felt as though she were more of a nuisance, a burden to his relentless pace, something that didn't fit into his perfectly curated world. The excitement they had once shared over picking out baby names and decorating the nursery had faded into the background of Jason's busy schedule. Rachel was left to take care of preparations by herself, a silent witness to the growing distance between them. As the days wore on, Rachel's heart grew heavier. She could feel the loneliness settling in, creeping into her thoughts like a dark cloud she couldn't escape. She would lie in bed at night, listening to the faint hum of Jason snoring, and yet she had never felt more alone. She would watch the clock tick slowly, wondering how many more nights she'd have to endure the silence, wondering how much longer she could pretend everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. And then there was the baby. Every kick, every movement inside her should have been a moment of connection, a moment of joy. But even that felt isolated. Her body was changing, her emotions running high, and she had no one to share it with. Jason, the man who had promised to be her partner, had become a shadow, fading into the background of her life. She would try to talk to him, beg him to listen, but he'd always have an excuse. "I'm too tired tonight, Rachel," or "I got a meeting first thing tomorrow." His excuses came like clockwork, and each one chipped away at her spirit. She began to wonder if he even noticed her anymore, if he even saw her. There were nights when she would find herself crying in the darkness, her hand resting gently on her swollen belly, trying to comfort herself as much as the baby inside her. She would tell herself that it was temporary, that things would get better once the baby arrived, once Jason had a chance to slow down. But deep down, she feared that even then nothing would change, and the thought of raising their child alone, without his support, gnawed at her every night. And so, when the evening arrived and Jason suggested they take a drive to the outskirts of town to pick up some things for the baby, Rachel had clung to that fleeting hope. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe tonight he would finally see her. Maybe tonight they could share something together, something that felt real. But when the car broke down, alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere, it wasn't just a vehicle that failed her. It was Jason once again. The one person she had believed would always be by her side had left her in a moment of need, without a second thought. And for Rachel, that moment felt like the culmination of everything that had been building for months. The loneliness, the neglect, the emotional isolation. She had hoped for so long that he would change, that he would finally wake up and realize what he was losing. But in the end, it wasn't just the car that was broken. It was their marriage. And she was beginning to accept the painful truth that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been alone all along. This was more than just a flat tire or a broken down car. This was a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong in their relationship. It was as if fate had conspired to remind Rachel just how far apart they had drifted. Her love, her hopes, and her faith had all been left stranded on the side of the road, just as she was. And Jason, the man who had promised to build a life with her, was nowhere to be found. In this moment, alone in the dark, with nothing but her thoughts and the hum of the broken engine, Rachel felt the weight of her emotions more acutely than ever. The pregnancy, which had once been a shared dream, now felt like the heaviest burden of all. And as the night stretched on, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been living in the shadows of a man who had forgotten to look back at the life they were supposed to build together. The cold evening air bit into Rachel's skin, sharp and unforgiving. The soft glow of the streetlights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the empty road. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, but it felt like another world, far away and disconnected from the isolation she now felt in the confines of the car. Her breath fogged up the windshield as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cool glass, staring into the darkness. The dashboard lit up with warning signals, red and urgent, the engine sputtering one final, desperate attempt before it fell silent. Rachel's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her heart racing in her chest. She pressed the ignition again and again, but the engine refused to start. The sound of the engine sputtering out, then nothing, was deafening in the quiet of the night. The car had been fine earlier that day. Everything had been fine. She'd driven home from the store, hoping to have a quiet evening alone, just a moment to unwind after a day filled with phone calls and unanswered messages. She thought about calling Jason, but each time, the phone felt heavier in her hand. He wouldn't pick up anyway. He never did. So she drove. But now, here she was, trapped, stranded in the middle of nowhere, far from the safety of their penthouse or the comfort of a warm, familiar space. Rachel took a deep breath, hoping for some semblance of control, But it didn't help. Her mind raced with anxiety. She thought about her pregnancy, how the baby was kicking inside her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in the car, but that only made her more scared. The baby's tiny movements seemed like a cruel reminder of just how vulnerable she was. Alone, cold, stranded in a car that refused to cooperate. The surrounding darkness seemed to close in around her, amplifying the emptiness. She looked out the window, eyes scanning the barren road, searching for any sign of life, of someone who might stop and help. But there was nothing. No headlights, no sound of approaching footsteps, just a relentless, eerie silence of the night. A cold wind swept through the crack in the window, sending a chill up her spine. She shivered, rubbing her arms in a futile attempt to warm herself. Her breath came in shaky bursts as the anxiety began to tighten its grip around her chest. What if something happened to her? What if she went into labor here, alone, in the middle of nowhere? Jason should have been here, with her. He should have been the one she could rely on, the one to come running when she needed him. But instead, all she had was the echo of his absence, a growing reminder that she wasn't truly seen, wasn't truly cared for. She fumbled with her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed his number again. The ringtone seemed to mock her, ringing, and in silence. Straight to voicemail. The sinking feeling in her stomach deepened. There was no way he hadn't seen her messages. He had to be ignoring her. A feeling of helplessness washed over her. She'd been patient for so long. She had waited for him to come around, to be the man he had once promised to be. But here she was, sitting in the dark, in the cold, in a car that was falling apart around her, and he wasn't there. He wasn't even answering the phone. Rachel let out a breath, her chest tight. The tension, the isolation, the fear, it all collided in that moment. She was alone. She was stranded. And the person who was supposed to protect her, to take care of her, was nowhere to be found. The car's lights flickered for a moment, a feeble attempt at life before they dimmed completely, leaving her in complete darkness. The weight of her pregnancy, the loneliness, and the deep sense of abandonment overwhelmed her all at once. The baby's tiny movements inside her felt distant now. Small comfort in the face of such a cold, harsh reality. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, had left her to face this moment alone. And for the first time in a long while, Rachel wondered just how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was fine. Jason's phone buzzed on the sleek marble countertop, the screen lighting up with an incoming notification. He glanced at it, his fingers poised above the screen before he swiped it away without a second thought. The message was from Rachel. He'd seen it pop up earlier, but now, as he took another sip of champagne in the dimly lit penthouse suite, he barely registered the anxiety that must have been behind her words. She had texted him that the car had broken down, and she was stranded, her voice laced with concern. A simple plea for help, for reassurance. But for Jason, that was a problem he could ignore. He looked around the penthouse, taking in the sprawling view of the city skyline from floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights flickered in the distance, a soft reminder of how far removed he was from the reality Rachel was facing. The sounds of music, laughter, and clinking glasses filled the air as he turned back to a group of investors and friends in the other room. The latest opportunity was too tempting to pass up. An exclusive event with potential business partners that could increase his company's value tenfold. This was his world now. This was his life. Rachel's message pinged again, louder this time, but Jason barely noticed. He was lost in conversation, shaking hands, laughing at jokes that didn't matter, his attention entirely consumed by the promises of another deal, another night of business mingling that could potentially bring him even more wealth, more influence. In that moment, her voice, the voice of the woman who had supported him through the years, the woman carrying their child, felt distant, unimportant. The weight of her message, the fear behind her words, was overshadowed by the fleeting excitement of the night's indulgence. He knew he should call her. He could have called her. But what good would that do? He reasoned that she would be fine. She was just being dramatic, as she often was. After all, she was safe in the car, wasn't she? There was no need to worry. It was just a car problem, a minor inconvenience that could be dealt with later. He texted back, not an offer of help, but a simple, dismissive line. "I'm in a meeting. can't talk right now. I'll deal with it later." Jason tucked his phone into his pocket, taking a deep breath before returning to his conversation. His mind quickly refocused on the now, on the deals, the faces around him who admired his every word, the promises of more money, more power. Jason wasn't angry at Rachel for interrupting him. He simply didn't see the urgency in his world. His empire was a priority. Rachel's world, the one she was living, was something he left behind long ago. The thought of her, stranded in the cold, seemed so far removed from his glamorous, busy life. She was fine, wasn't she? She could handle it. After all, she always did. And as the hours passed, Jason's attention never wavered from the party around him. He raised his glass, smiling wide, while Rachel sat alone, waiting in the dark. Jason's eyes lingered on the screen of his phone for a moment, his fingers hovering over the keys. He knew he should be more concerned. After all, his wife was alone, pregnant, stranded in the middle of nowhere, but the buzzing of the city outside his penthouse window, the laughter from the other room, the promise of the business deal he was about to close, all of it felt so much more immediate, so much more important. His mind raced with calculations. The investors were waiting. The deal was almost done. He had put so much time, so much effort into this night, into the success of his company, and he couldn't afford to lose momentum now. Not for something as trivial as a broken car. The moment he left, the opportunity might slip away. The chance to further cement his place at the top. He couldn't let that happen. Rachel, though, she was always so dramatic, always pulling at his sleeve, trying to get his attention when the world was moving forward without them. She had always been there, waiting for him to get it together, to make time for her and their family. But right now, that wasn't what he needed. He couldn't afford to be a husband or a father tonight. He had bigger things on his plate. Jason tapped out a quick response on his phone. It was short, impersonal, the words just enough to placate her for now. "I'm in a meeting. Don't worry. Someone will stop and help you." The flicker of guilt that crossed his mind was easily swept away. It wasn't his fault she'd broken down. It wasn't his problem. He was making his future right now. And Rachel? She was just being Rachel. She could handle herself. He didn't even pause before slipping the phone back into his pocket. His attention shifted back to the party. The hum of conversation. The clink of glasses filled with expensive liquor. His friends, his colleagues, were waiting for him, eager to celebrate the deal that would elevate him even further. They didn't care about his wife's car trouble. For Jason, the choice was clear. Business first. Always. He grabbed his jacket, adjusting the collar with the same precision he perfected over the years. Another opportunity was slipping through his fingers, and he wasn't about to let it slip away over something he deemed insignificant. The streets of the city below called to him, lit up, alive, filled with the kind of energy he fed on, the world of luxury, power, and influence that had become his second skin. Rachel would be fine. The car would get fixed. Someone would come along. She could wait. His heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as he moved toward the door. He didn't look back. In his mind, this was just another night, another step toward his own success, another moment where family, his wife, was secondary. After all, he told himself, he was doing all of this for her, wasn't he? For their future, for the life he was building. She'd understand. Eventually, as the door clicked shut behind him, the weight of his decision hung in the air, brief, fleeting. But to Rachel, alone and cold in that broken-down car, it would feel like a betrayal that echoed through every inch of her being. In the warmth of the penthouse, Jason stood amidst his world of glass and chrome, surrounded by the glimmer of success. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, the city's lights twinkling like stars, as if everything in his life had finally aligned perfectly. He was the center of it all. The businessman, the man with the power, the one who had everything at his fingertips. Champagne flowed freely, and laughter filled the air as his guests discussed the future of his empire. He was at the peak, the very top of the mountain, and in that moment, nothing could touch him. In front of him was a life he had worked relentlessly for, a life of excess and luxury. The marble floors beneath his feet felt cold but polished, a reflection of his perfect, calculated world. Expensive art lined the walls, and the flickering light from the chandelier overhead seemed almost surreal, like a moment frozen in time. He had everything, and yet in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter more than securing his place among the elites. The people around him were drawn to his power, to his success. But somewhere out there, Rachel, his pregnant wife, was fighting a different kind of battle. Meanwhile, Rachel sat in the cold, abandoned car, the darkness surrounding her like a suffocating blanket. The chill of the night air pierced through the thin layers of her clothing, seeping into her bones as she tried to calm her racing heart. She was alone, utterly alone, and her situation was growing more desperate with every passing minute. Her phone lay next to her, the screen dim from the lack of response. No lights flickered from any passing cars. No one was coming. The emptiness of the road stretched out before her, a vast, desolate scene that seemed to mirror her feelings of abandonment. The baby inside her shifted, reminding her of the life she was carrying. Life that depended on her, but here she was, left stranded in the middle of nowhere, her needs and fears ignored. She thought of Jason, of the promises they had made, the future they had envisioned. Yet, here she was, alone in the car, far from the world he had promised to share with her. The contrast was undeniable. In the penthouse, Jason continued his conversation, nodding along as another deal was discussed, another plan set in motion. The buzz of luxury and opportunity hummed around him, but his mind was somewhere else, miles away from Rachel's cold, silent world. He didn't think about her, didn't consider the fact that she was probably sitting in the dark, her phone screen glowing faintly as she tried to get a hold of him. His priorities were clear. This party, this deal, the future of his company were all that mattered. He had no room for the vulnerability of his wife. The woman carrying his child, waiting for him, had become an afterthought, a side note to his greater ambitions. And there, in the silence of the car, Rachel hugged her swollen belly, a soft, silent tear tracing her cheek. The contrast was as sharp as a knife. The lavish life Jason was living, the life she had once dreamed of, and the painful, aching reality she now found herself in. What had once been an equal partnership had become a one-sided equation, where the balance of love and support had tipped heavily in Jason's favor, leaving Rachel to carry the weight of their promises on her own. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the wind whistled through the cracks in the window. It was as if the world around her was whispering the same painful truth. She was alone. Jason's world of privilege, wealth, and success had no place for her in this moment. The longer she sat in that car, the more the gap between their worlds seemed impossible to bridge. In the safety of his penthouse, Jason celebrated his victories, some of which Rachel had supported him in, some of which had been built on the sacrifices she'd made. But out here, in the cold, the only thing that mattered was getting through the night. All she wanted was a sign, a glimmer of the man who had once promised to be her partner, her equal. But the penthouse glittered far away, just another symbol of the man he had become. Too far removed from the woman who had loved him, too absorbed in his own life to reach back and pull her from the shadows. Rachel's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing in 1,000 directions. The car's engine had given out completely, and despite her best attempt to restart it, nothing happened. The silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her own breath. Shallow, quick, as she tried to steady herself. Her eyes darted the phone in her lap, and she picked it up once again, her heart sinking as she saw the missed calls and unread messages. She had reached out to Jason, twice now, but the silence on the other end of the line only deepened her sense of isolation. Why wasn't he answering? The thoughts flooded her mind. Was he too busy to help? Was he even thinking about her right now? She dialed his number again, her fingers pressing the screen with urgency. The phone rang once, twice, and then again, only to be met with the all-too-familiar voicemail. "Hey, it's Jason. I'm unavailable right now. Leave a message." Rachel's heart sank. She hung up and stared at the screen, a deep wave of panic sweeping over her. She was stranded. Her husband, the man she had trusted to be there for her, was nowhere to be found. The night outside had turned colder, and the wind began to pick up, rattling the car and sending shivers down Rachel's spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill, but it wasn't just the temperature that made her feel cold. It was a gnawing fear, The creeping anxiety that she was truly alone in this. What if no one came to help? The thought gnawed at her. What if something went wrong? What if, trying to shake off the panic rising in her chest, Rachel forced herself to focus. She glanced at the dashboard once more, desperate for any sign of life, any solution to the dead silence that surrounded her. Maybe, just maybe, there was something she could do herself. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car, her feet crunching on the gravel as she made her way to the hood. The night air was biting, and Rachel felt it in every inch of her body, but she wasn't thinking about the cold anymore. She opened the hood, her hands fumbled with the latch, desperate to make something work, anything that could get her moving again. She wasn't an expert on cars, but in this moment, it didn't matter. She had to do something. The engine sputtered mockingly at her, and despite her efforts, nothing changed. There were no lights, no sign of life, just the same dark silence that had followed her since the moment the car had stalled. Her hands shook, frustration bubbling up as she slammed the hood down. Why wasn't Jason here? A rush of helplessness hit her, and for a brief moment, Rachel felt the weight of everything crashing down. The baby inside her shifted again, a small movement that should have brought comfort, but only deepened her isolation. I'm supposed to protect you, she thought, but right now, I'm the one who needs protecting. The helplessness began to suffocate her, the reality of being stranded in the cold, alone with no help in sight, amplifying the fear that had been growing inside her for so long. She could feel the panic rising now, her chest tightening, her breath coming in short, quick gasps. This wasn't how it was supposed to be, she thought. Jason was supposed to be here. He was supposed to be the one I could rely on. Desperation began to claw at her as she climbed back into the car, her hands still trembling. The phone in her lap stared back at her, a reminder that no matter how many times she called, no matter how many times she reached out, Jason's world was somewhere else. Somewhere far away, where she couldn't reach him. Rachel stood beside the broken-down car, her body tense with both the cold and the weight of the emotions swirling inside her. She tried to force herself to focus on the task at hand, getting the car started, finding a way out of this nightmare. But every movement felt heavy, as though she was fighting against an invisible force that was steadily wearing her down. The silence around her was deafening, amplifying the fear she tried so hard to suppress. She could feel her heart thudding in her chest, a constant reminder of the dread that was building within her. Why wasn't Jason here? Her mind kept returning to that question, the one she couldn't seem to escape. The phone calls she had made had gone unanswered, each ring louder than the last, echoing in her mind as a cruel reminder of her isolation. The truth was starting to settle in her chest like a stone. Jason wasn't coming. And no matter how many times she called or how many messages she sent, she knew, deep down, that this was something she was going to have to handle alone. That knowledge brought a wave of despair that nearly knocked her to her knees. Her thoughts began to spiral. What if something happened to me? What if I can't get the car started? What if I go into labor here, in the middle of nowhere, with no one to help? The uncertainty gripped her, squeezing tight around her chest, making it harder to breathe. She could feel the baby shifting inside her, a quiet reminder of the life she was carrying, of the precious little one depending on her. She had imagined this moment, the anticipation of becoming a mother, the joy of creating a family with Jason. But never like this, never alone. Her hands cradled her swollen belly for comfort, as though she could somehow shield the child from the mounting panic that clawed at her. What if Jason never cared enough to be there for us? The question broke through her defenses, raw and unspoken. The man she had trusted, the man she had loved, had chosen business, parties, and power over her, over their child. She turned away from the car and leaned against the cold metal, wrapping her arms around her middle, as if it could provide some comfort, some connection to the life growing inside her. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing around her, the emptiness of the road magnify her sense of abandonment. I've always been there for him. I've always been patient, understanding. Why does it feel like no one is here for me? Her mind continued to churn with these thoughts, each one more bitter than the last. She had spent so many years supporting Jason, putting his dreams first, waiting for him to come around, for him to see that she was just as important as his business, his ambitions. But tonight it was clear. She was nothing but an afterthought, a second priority. And the fear that followed that realization was suffocating. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, not wanting to show weakness to the night that had already swallowed her up. She couldn't afford to break down. Not now, not when the stakes were so high. She had to be strong, for her baby, for herself. But the longer she stood there, the more she realized just how alone she really was. And it hurt. It hurt in a way she never expected. Like a deep ache that wouldn't go away, no matter how hard she tried to push it down. The baby kicked again, a small reminder that their life, was still moving forward. But Rachel wasn't sure she had the strength to keep up anymore. Meanwhile, in a luxurious penthouse high above the city, Jason was living in a world far removed from the cold, desolate roadside where Rachel was stranded. The scene in the suite was a dazzling spectacle of wealth, excess, and carefree celebration. The low hum of music mixed with the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter, filling the air with an infectious energy that seemed to seep into every corner of the space. The lights in the penthouse were dim, casting an alluring glow on the polished surfaces. Every inch of the suite screamed opulence, chandeliers glittering above, designer furniture, and the sweeping view of the city stretching endlessly below them. It was everything Jason had worked for, everything he had strived to build. Here, in this moment, he was untouchable, the king of his domain. He leaned back against the bar, a glass of expensive whiskey in hand, smiling widely as his friends toasted to another successful deal. Laughter rang out around him as they discussed business ventures, private jets, and luxury holidays. The world outside the penthouse seemed a distant memory, a faraway place he no longer felt connected to. Here, there was no room for weakness, no time for personal matters, only the allure of the next big thing. Jason's phone buzzed again, but he didn't even glance at it. The messages from Rachel had been pouring in, one after another, but he had dismissed them with a flick of his finger. After all, it was just another one of her dramas, wasn't it? He had seen it all before. She could handle herself. There was no reason to interrupt the celebration. He was surrounded by his closest colleagues, people who admired him, who looked up to him as a figure of power and success. What was a broken-down car compared to all of this? He raised his glass, letting the amber liquid swirl, and grinned as someone cracked a joke about the latest investment opportunity. The group laughed, carefree and full of life, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the fact that one of their own was struggling, stranded on the side of a road, trying to make sense of the mess he had left her in. Rachel's voice pinged his phone again, but he silenced it without a second thought. He didn't need to read the messages. He didn't need to hear her voice. He could always call her later, right? There was still time to smooth things over, to pretend like he hadn't completely dismissed her in favor of the lifestyle he'd worked so hard to create. Tonight, he was the entrepreneur, the businessman who had it all. Tonight, the rest of the world, his wife, his responsibilities, could wait. As the night wore on, Jason continued to sip his drink, surrounded by his high-flying friends, his mind completely occupied with the next deal, the next opportunity, the next round of celebrations. He reveled in the attention, in the admiration, in the security that wealth and success provided. What he didn't realize, what he couldn't see, despite everything around him, was that the very foundation of his life was crumbling piece by piece outside the sparkling walls of his penthouse. Rachel, meanwhile, sat alone in the car. The cold air had settled in, thick and unyielding, while Jason's world continued to spin, untouched by the reality she was facing. The contrast between their lives, the one he had chosen and the one she was forced to endure, was so stark it was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet, there he was, laughing, partying, oblivious of the growing storm just beyond the glass walls of his empire. As the night stretched on, Jason's world became more and more detached from the reality that Rachel was facing. Inside the penthouse, he was surrounded by the glitz and glamour of his carefully curated life. The people around him, smiling, laughing, clinking glasses, seemed to exist in the same bubble of success and excess that he had created. There was no room for worry, no room for vulnerability. Here, everything was perfect. He barely registered the passage of time, lost in conversation with business associates, laughing at jokes that were shallow at best, as they sipped expensive cocktails and talked about nothing of real substance. The music pulsed in the background, a constant soundtrack to his self-contained world. His ego swelled with every compliment, every deal discussed. In his mind, he was untouchable, a titan of industry, a man who had everything at his fingertips. The weight of his success was something he wore like an invisible armor, shielding him from any hint of guilt or responsibility. Every congratulatory toast, every high five, only further removed him from the world outside the penthouse walls. But outside, on the darkened road, where Rachel sat in the cold, the silence was deafening. She was freezing, alone, desperate for a sign of life. Her phone was practically useless now, the screen dim from lack of charge, the messages still unanswered. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. Yet Jason, inside his lofty perch, didn't even glance at his phone anymore. He was lost in the laughter and the music, his mind too far gone to consider the toll his actions had taken on the woman he had promised to care for. The thought that Rachel might be struggling, might be afraid, never entered his mind. He was too consumed by the moment, by the fleeting joy of another night of luxury. There was no part of him that stopped to consider the weight of his negligence. It didn't matter to him that she was carrying their child, that she was isolated and vulnerable in his world. The only thing that mattered was himself, his success, and the people who fed into that success. The disconnect was profound. The idea that the woman who had stood by his side for years, who had supported him through every obstacle, was now sitting alone in the dark, helpless. This didn't cross his mind. He was too far removed, too wrapped up in the illusion of invincibility that wealth and status had given him. It was as if the world outside of his penthouse suite simply didn't exist. Rachel's situation, her distress, the growing silence between them, none of it seemed real. It wasn't his problem. His life had become a parade of parties, deals, and fleeting moments of excitement, all built on a foundation of neglect. The further he distanced himself from Rachel's needs, the more detached he became from the very reality that was falling apart around him. He could have reached out. He could have called. He could have been there for her. But Jason didn't. Instead, he took another sip from his glass, his smile widening, completely unaware of the emotional damage he was inflicting. In his mind, he was too busy living in the moment, in the life he had worked so hard to build. The cracks in his marriage, the woman he had left behind, they didn't even register. To him, it was all just part of the game, all just background noise to the high life he'd come to believe he deserved. As the hours dragged on, Rachel's sense of helplessness deepened, settling over her like a heavy blanket she couldn't shake off. The night had grown colder, and the wind began to bite at her skin, sharper than before. Every minute that passed seemed to pull her further into despair. Her hands, stiff with cold, fumbled over the engine, trying in vain to get the car to start again. Each failed attempt felt like a punch to the gut, a harsh reminder of just how alone she truly was. The phone in her hand buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message from Jason. It was a notification from a friend she'd texted earlier, letting her know she would try to reach out to someone who could help. But her friend was miles away, and she knew that waiting on others had become a futile exercise. No one was coming. The cold crept into her bones, and the anxiety in her chest surged, tightening with every passing moment. Her body began to feel the toll of the ordeal, the sharp pain in her back from sitting awkwardly in the car, the pressure building in her belly, and the heavy weight of exhaustion creeping in. Her baby moved inside her, but instead of offering comfort, it was a painful reminder of the responsibility she was carrying alone. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to act. With trembling hands, Rachel opened the car door and stepped out onto the dark road. Her shoes scraped against the gravel as she slowly made her way along the empty highway. The cold air stung her lungs, but it was the anxiety and fear that gripped her the most. What if I collapse? What if I can't make it to safety? The thought of labor starting here, on this road, with no one around, terrified her. But then, as if to cut through the isolation, a faint light appeared in the distance. A car, a real possibility of help. Her pulse quickened as she waved her arms desperately, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts as she tried to catch the driver's attention. "Please, let this be the one. Please." The car slowed down, coming to a stop just a few feet from her. A man rolled down the window, his face filled with concern as he took in her distress. Without hesitation, he stepped out of his vehicle and immediately offered her a hand, guiding her into the warmth of his car. "I'll get you somewhere safe, don't worry," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. A stark contrast to the chaos of the night she had just endured. For the first time in hours, Rachel allowed herself to breathe a little easier, her heart still racing but no longer in panic. The fear of being alone had subsided, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude as the stranger drove her to safety. Days passed before Rachel finally made it back home. The quiet weight of the night she'd spent stranded with a stranger still hanging heavily over her. It was a night that had changed everything. She had never felt more alone, more abandoned, and yet somehow it had forced her to face the reality of her relationship with Jason. The harsh truth was impossible to ignore. When she arrived back at the penthouse, Jason was there, standing by the large windows, staring out at the city below, seemingly lost in thought. The moment Rachel stepped inside, she could feel the cold air between them. It wasn't the physical coldness of the night she'd just endured. It was something much deeper, something more painful. She didn't wait for him to speak. The silence was already thick enough. "Where were you, Jason?" Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it now. The years of being the silent supporter, the wife who always put him first, had evaporated in that single night of abandonment. "Where were you when I needed you?" Jason turned slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The words he prepared, excuses, justifications, seemed meaningless now, floating uselessly in the air between them. It was as though the distance between them had become a physical barrier he couldn't cross. Rachel's eyes were filled with hurt, the years of silent frustration finally spilling over. "I was out there alone, cold, pregnant. And you?" Her voice cracked, but she pushed on, determined to make him hear the pain she'd been hiding. "You were too busy with your party, too busy with your business to even pick up the phone." "I was alone, Jason, and that's how I've been feeling for so long. Alone, in this marriage, in this life." Her words hung in the air like a thick fog, choking the space between them. Jason finally spoke, but his voice was distant, disconnected. I didn't know it was that serious." His words were flat, lacking the sincerity that Rachel had hoped for. The realization of what he'd done was just beginning to dawn on him, but it seemed like an afterthought, something he couldn't quite grasp fully. "I was working. I was trying to make sure we had everything we needed." Rachel cut him off, her voice growing stronger, her frustration finally giving way to anger. "Everything we need? You think money and success are all I need? You think your business is more important than me, more important than your family?" Jason's face remained impassive, his emotions hidden behind a mask he perfected over the years. "I was just doing what I had to do, Rachel. You know that." For a moment, there was a heavy silence between them, thick with the weight of their unspoken truths. Rachel stood there, staring at him with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. She had expected an apology, some recognition of the pain he had caused her, but instead, all she got was indifference, an emotion so cold it felt like a slap in the face. "I can't keep doing this," she said softly, shaking her head. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she regained her composure, holding her ground. "I can't keep waiting for you to see me, to see us. I'm not just some part of your success story. I'm your wife, and I'm carrying your child. And I deserve more than what you gave me, more than this empty marriage." Jason's eyes flickered for a moment, just a moment, as the gravity of her words began to settle in. Maybe, for the first time, he saw her, not just as his partner in life, but as a woman with needs, with emotions, with a life that didn't revolve around his ambitions. But the moment passed quickly, and instead of reaching out, instead of offering the apology she so desperately needed, he simply stood there, lost in his own thoughts. The truth hit Rachel like a tidal wave. The man she had married, the man she had loved, was standing there, detached, unable to connect with the reality of what he had done. His remorse, if it existed at all, was buried so deeply under layers of self-absorption that it was nearly impossible to find. "I need space," Rachel said, her voice a whisper now. The finality in her words hung heavy in the room. I need to figure out what comes next. For me, for our baby. But right now, I can't stay here. Not like this. With those words, she turned and walked away, leaving Jason standing by the window, staring out at the city lights once more, lost in his own world, still not fully understanding the depth of what had just happened. As Rachel left the penthouse, the door closing behind her with a soft click, Jason stood frozen. He thought he would feel relief, or maybe even a sense of guilt, but instead he just felt empty. Her absence, her departure, should have caused something in him to stir, but it didn't. Not yet. The realization of what he had lost, the wife he had neglected, the family he had taken for granted, came slowly, like a fog creeping in. But by the time he finally understood the gravity of the situation, it was already too late. The consequences of his actions were clear now, but the damage had been done. And whether or not Jason could ever fully grasp the pain he had caused was uncertain. What was certain, though, was that the woman who had once been his everything had walked away, her heart broken, her trust shattered. And that was a consequence he couldn't undo, no matter how much success or wealth he accumulated in the future. In the end, the most important thing had always been in front of him, but it was only after it slipped away that he realized just how much he had taken for granted.